Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. In the early 1970s, the United States was undergoing rapid social change. College campuses were expanding, hitchhiking was common, and trust between strangers was often assumed. It was during this period that Ted Bundy began a series of crimes that would later redefine how America understood violent offenders. What made Bundy especially dangerous was not just what he did, but how completely he blended into everyday life while doing it. Ted Bundy appeared, by most outward measures, to be an unlikely criminal. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and politically active, even volunteering on political campaigns. He attended college, held jobs, and socialized easily. Friends and acquaintances described him as polite and charming. There were no obvious signs that he was capable of extreme violence. This normalcy became his greatest weapon, allowing him to approach people without raising suspicion and to move through communities unnoticed. Behind this carefully maintained image, Bundy was living a double life. His crimes began quietly, with victims disappearing under circumstances that seemed random and unconnected. Because the crimes occurred across different states, law enforcement agencies initially struggled to link them together. At the time, there was limited coordination between jurisdictions, and the idea that one individual could be responsible for multiple crimes across state lines was not immediately accepted. Bundy exploited the social norms of the era. He often presented himself as injured or in need of assistance, relying on sympathy and trust to gain cooperation. Witnesses later recalled seeing him in public places, college campuses, parks, and crowded areas, acting in ways that appeared harmless. These encounters rarely stood out at the time, only gaining significance once investigators began piecing together patterns years later. As disappearances increased, fear slowly spread across communities, especially among young women. Posters appeared, searches were organized, and families waited for answers that did not come. Yet Bundy continued to live openly, maintaining relationships and avoiding serious scrutiny. Even when his name first surfaced in connection with the investigation, those who knew him struggled to reconcile the accusations with the person they believed they knew. A killer who did not hide in the shadows, but operated in plain sight. His ability to appear trustworthy delayed suspicion and allowed his crimes to continue longer than they might have otherwise. This chapter is not about confessions or capture. It is about invisibility, deception, and how appearances can be dangerously misleading. As the number of disappearances continued to grow, law enforcement agencies across several states began to realize that they were not dealing with isolated crimes. Patterns slowly emerged. Young women vanishing from college campuses and public spaces, witnesses recalling a man who introduced himself as Ted, and reports of a suspect who appeared calm, educated, and non-threatening. Despite these similarities, coordination between states was limited, and critical time was lost as investigators struggled to connect the dots. During this period, Ted Bundy remained free and increasingly bold. He adjusted his methods, moved between states, and exploited gaps in communication between police departments. In some cases, sketch descriptions circulated, but Bundy's appearance was so ordinary that it matched thousands of men. He even volunteered information to police tip lines, inserting himself into investigations in a way that gave him insight into what authorities knew and what they didn't. Bundy's first major arrest came in 1975, not for murder, but for kidnapping. The case relied heavily on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Although he was convicted, the sentence was relatively short compared to the scale of his crimes. While incarcerated, Bundy continued to manipulate those around him. He studied law, represented himself in court, and used legal loopholes to delay proceedings. His confidence and intelligence often worked in his favor, convincing some that the evidence against him was weak or exaggerated. In a stunning turn of events, Bundy escaped from custody, not once, but twice, while awaiting trial. These escapes shocked the nation and exposed serious flaws in the criminal justice system. Each escape reinforced the idea that Bundy was not only dangerous, but highly calculating. During his time on the run, he committed additional crimes, proving that even increased scrutiny had not stopped him. Public fear intensified as his name became synonymous with failure at every level of containment. Eventually, Bundy was recaptured and extradited to Florida, where the case reached its most violent and visible phase. The crimes committed during this period left no doubt about the threat he posed. Media coverage exploded, turning Bundy into a national figure and raising uncomfortable questions about how long he had been allowed to operate freely. Investigators now faced the reality that countless opportunities to stop him had been missed. The escalation of the Ted Bundy case, not just in terms of violence, but in exposure. This was the stage where Bundy transitioned from a hidden threat to a national symbol of danger. His arrests, escapes, and manipulation of the legal system demonstrated how intelligence and confidence could be weaponized against institutions meant to protect the public. By the end of this chapter, the focus had shifted from identifying a suspect to containing a criminal who had already proven how devastating institutional failure could be. The final phase of the Ted Bundy case unfolded under intense national scrutiny. By the late 1970s, Ted Bundy was no longer an unknown suspect moving quietly between states. He was one of the most infamous criminals in America. After his recapture in Florida, the justice system closed in with a determination that had been missing for years. This time, there would be no leniency, no overlooked warnings, and no opportunity for escape. Bundy's trials became a media spectacle. He chose to represent himself in court, a decision that stunned observers, but fit perfectly with his need for control and attention. Confident, articulate, and composed, he cross-examined witnesses and addressed the court directly, attempting to cast doubt on overwhelming evidence. For many watching, the contrast was disturbing. A man accused of extreme violence, presenting himself as intelligent and rational. The trials forced the public to confront how easily appearances can mislead. As appeals failed and execution loomed, Bundy's behavior shifted. On death row, he began offering confessions to law enforcement officials, psychologists, and investigators. These admissions were often calculated, released in pieces, sometimes vague, sometimes detailed, and frequently framed in the third person. Bundy appeared to use his confessions as bargaining tools, delaying execution by promising new information. While some of his statements helped investigators close unsolved cases, others raised doubts, as he continued to manipulate narratives even at the end of his life. Bundy's confessions provided rare insight into criminal psychology. He spoke about patterns, impulses, and escalation, offering explanations that were chilling in their calmness. Yet experts noted that his statements were not acts of remorse, but extensions of control. He rarely acknowledged victims directly, instead focusing on himself and the intellectual framing of his crimes. The Ted Bundy Files became less about closure and more about understanding how deception, charm, and ego could coexist with extreme violence. In January 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the scale of harm he had caused. His death marked the end of one of the most damaging criminal cases in U.S. history, but not the end of its impact. Families of victims were left with grief that no execution could erase, and investigators were left with lessons learned too late. The Ted Bundy case reshaped law enforcement practices, improved interagency communication, and permanently changed how serial offenders are identified and investigated. It exposed the dangers of underestimating criminals based on appearance and intelligence, and it highlighted the consequences of institutional hesitation. The confessions Bundy left behind remain studied not because they explain evil fully, but because they show how easily it can hide, speak convincingly, and exploit trust until it is finally confronted.